I'm Mira, 22 years old, and everything changed when my aunt asked a simple question at Christmas dinner that exposed the biggest betrayal of my life. It was December 23rd, and our family had gathered at my parents' house in Sacramento like we did every year. The dining room was decorated with the same red and gold ornaments my mother Lorelei had been using since I was a child, the smell of her famous honey-glazed ham filling the air while everyone passed around dishes and caught up on the year's events. My aunt Helena, my father Adrian's older sister, had driven down from Portland with my cousin Rowan, and the conversation had been flowing easily between work updates, travel stories, and the usual family gossip that made these gatherings both comforting and exhausting. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how one dinner conversation unraveled 22 years of lies. Helena had always been the successful one in the family, running her own consulting firm and traveling internationally for business. She'd never married, pouring all her energy into her career and her son Rowan, who was exactly my age and had always been held up as the family's golden child. While I struggled through community college and worked part-time at a local bookstore, Rowan had graduated from Harvard the previous spring and was already working at a prestigious law firm in Boston. The comparison between us had been a constant source of quiet shame for me, especially during family gatherings where his achievements were celebrated while my own modest accomplishments were barely acknowledged. My parents, Adrian and Lorelei, had always been quick to point out how different we were, how Rowan had always been focused and driven, while I seemed to drift through life without direction or ambition. As we finished the main course, and Lorelei began clearing plates, Helena turned to me with the warm smile she'd always given me since I was little. "Mira, I've been meaning to ask you about your studies. How's everything going with the Harvard scholarship we set up for you? I know it took a while to get all the paperwork sorted, but you should be able to transfer there next fall, right?" The question hit me like a physical blow, confusion washing over me as I tried to process what she'd said. I set down my wine glass, my hand trembling slightly as I looked around the table. My younger sister Nova, who was home from her private college for winter break, had gone completely still, her fork halfway to her mouth. My parents had both frozen, Adrian's face draining of color while Lorelei's eyes darted between Helena and me with something that looked like panic. "What scholarship?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange in my mouth, like I was speaking a foreign language. Helena's smile faltered as she looked from me to my parents, clearly sensing that something was very wrong. "The scholarship fund I've been contributing to since you were 14, she said slowly, her voice taking on a careful tone. "The one your parents told me about when you were struggling in high school. I've been sending money every semester to help with your education costs." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of our neighbor's dog barking in the distance. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stared at my father, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of what I was hearing. Adrian cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on his plate as he mumbled something under his breath. "What did you say, Dad?" I asked, my voice stronger now but still shaking. He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of guilt and resignation that made my stomach twist. "She wasn't smart enough for Harvard," he said quietly, the words hitting me like a slap across the face. "We didn't want to disappoint Helena, so we used the money for other things. Nova's tuition, some business expenses. Mira was never going to make it into a school like that anyway." Helena's face had gone completely white, her hand reaching for her purse with movements that seemed too deliberate, too controlled. "Adrian, what are you talking about?" Helena's voice was deadly calm as she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "I've sent over $45,000 a year for the past 4 years. That's $180,000 total." She turned the phone toward the rest of the table, showing what appeared to be bank transfer records. Every payment was specifically designated for Mira's education fund. Where did that money go? The numbers on the screen seemed impossible, too large to be real. I had been working minimum wage jobs and taking out student loans to pay for community college classes, eating ramen noodles most nights because I couldn't afford groceries, while my parents had been receiving nearly $200,000 intended for my education. Nova finally spoke, her voice small and shaky. "Mira, I'm so sorry. I thought you knew. I thought you just didn't want to go to Harvard." The betrayal in her words cut deeper than anything my parents had said. The realization that my own sister had been complicit in this deception for years. Helena was still staring at the phone screen, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. "Rowan got into Harvard on his own merit," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But I specifically told you, Adrian, that this money was for Mira. I wanted to give her the same opportunities." The room had fallen completely silent except for the sound of Lorelai's quiet crying, her hands pressed against her mouth as if she could somehow take back everything that had been revealed. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom with the kind of headache that comes from crying yourself to sleep. The previous night's revelation kept replaying in my mind like a broken record, each detail more devastating than the last. Helena had left shortly after showing us the bank records, taking Rowan with her after he quietly apologized for something he'd had no part in creating. My parents had retreated to their room without another word, leaving Nova and me sitting in the dining room surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to be a celebration. Nova had tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other as she insisted she thought I knew about the money, but had chosen not to use it. The look of genuine confusion on her face when I told her I'd never even applied to Harvard made me realize that my parents had been lying to everyone, creating an elaborate web of deception that had lasted for years. I spent the early hours of Christmas Eve morning going through old emails and documents on my laptop, searching for any trace of the scholarship money Helena had mentioned. What I found instead were records of my parents' financial struggles that I'd never known about. Adrian's consulting business had been failing for the past 3 years, with multiple late payment notices and threatening letters from creditors hidden in a folder marked business expenses. There were bank statements showing regular deposits of exactly the amounts Helena had described, followed immediately by transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. The pattern was clear and systematic, money coming in earmarked for my education and immediately being diverted elsewhere. I felt sick reading through the documents, understanding for the first time that my family's comfortable lifestyle had been subsidized by money that was supposed to secure my future. The financial records led me to remember conversations from high school that had never made sense at the time, when my guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had mentioned that several colleges were interested in my SAT scores. My parents had brushed off her suggestions to apply to prestigious schools. "Mira's not cut out for that level of competition," Lorelai had said with the kind of dismissive tone that had trained me not to argue. When I'd expressed interest in advanced placement classes, Adrian had convinced me that I was setting myself up for failure and disappointment. Every time I'd shown academic ambition or curiosity, they'd found ways to redirect me toward more realistic options. I'd internalized their low expectations so completely that I'd stopped pushing myself, accepting their assessment that I was average at best. Sitting in my old room surrounded by participation trophies and B- report cards, I began to question everything I thought I knew about my own abilities. I pulled out my old school records and was shocked to discover that my GPA had been higher than I remembered, consistently above 3.7 throughout high school. My SAT scores, which my parents had dismissed as decent but nothing special, were actually in the 95th percentile. I found college brochures that I'd hidden under my mattress as a teenager, dreams of studying literature at prestigious universities that I'd been taught to view as unrealistic fantasies. The evidence of my academic potential was right there in black and white, contradicting years of messaging that I wasn't smart enough for anything beyond community college and part-time work. Christmas Day passed in a tense silence, with my parents avoiding eye contact and Helena calling twice to check on me. During the second call, she revealed details that made the betrayal even more complex. "I started sending that money when you were 14 because Adrian told me you were struggling with depression and needed private tutoring," she explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He said you were bright but needed extra support to reach your potential. I believed I was helping you build a foundation for success." The irony was crushing. My father had convinced his sister to fund my education by claiming I needed help, then used that same money to pay for Nova's private college tuition and his failing business while telling me I wasn't capable of academic achievement. Nova tried to bridge the gap between us on Christmas night, sitting on my bed like she used to when we were younger. "I really thought you knew about Aunt Helena's money," she said, her eyes red from crying. When I got my acceptance letter to Whitmore Academy, Mom said the family education fund was covering my tuition. I assumed you'd used yours for community college and just had money left over. Her explanation revealed another layer of the deception. My parents had told her that there was a family education fund that we both had access to, when in reality, Helena's money had been specifically designated for me alone. Nova's private college tuition, which I'd always assumed was being paid through loans or my parents' savings, had actually been funded by stealing my scholarship money. The conversation with Nova led to more revelations about our family's financial situation. She'd been told that Adrian's business was thriving, explaining the family's comfortable lifestyle and her expensive education. She had no idea about the mounting debts or the fact that our parents had been living beyond their means for years. "They told me you were happy at community college," she said, her voice breaking. "They said you weren't interested in a traditional 4-year university experience. I thought it was your choice." The systematic nature of the lies was staggering. My parents had crafted different narratives for different family members, ensuring that no one had enough information to piece together the truth about where Helena's money was actually going. By the end of Christmas weekend, I'd uncovered enough evidence to understand the scope of what had been stolen from me. Helena's scholarship money hadn't just been misappropriated. It had been actively used to fund a lifestyle and opportunities for Nova that should have been mine. While I'd been working nights at the bookstore and taking out loans for community college classes, my younger sister had been attending private school and living in a dorm room paid for with my aunt's generosity. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was the deliberate destruction of my self-confidence and academic ambition, carried out by the people who were supposed to support my growth and success. The confrontation with my parents came 2 days after Christmas, when I finally worked up the courage to present them with everything I'd discovered. I'd printed out bank statements, old report cards, and Helena's transfer records, organizing them into a folder that felt like evidence in a criminal case. Adrian and Lorelai were sitting at the kitchen table with their morning coffee when I walked in, and the way they both tensed when they saw the papers in my hands told me they'd been expecting this conversation. "We need to talk about the money," I said, my voice steadier than I felt as I sat across from them. "All of it. The scholarship fund, Nova's tuition, your business debts, everything." Lorelai immediately started crying. Not the genuine tears of remorse, but the manipulative sobbing she'd used throughout my childhood whenever she was caught in wrongdoing. "Mira, you have to understand," Adrian began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that had shaped so many of our conversations over the years. "We were protecting you from disappointment. Helena had these unrealistic expectations about your academic potential, and we knew you'd never be able to live up to them. The gaslighting was so immediate and automatic that it took my breath away. Even faced with concrete evidence of their deception, they were still trying to convince me that stealing my future had been an act of parental love. You saw my SAT scores," I said, sliding the documents across the table. "You saw my grades. You know I was qualified for competitive schools." Lorelai looked up from her fake tears with an expression that was almost pitying. "And test scores don't mean everything, sweetheart. You've always been so sensitive, so fragile. We couldn't bear to watch you fail at something so important." The word fragile triggered something in me, a flash of anger that I'd been suppressing for years. "I was fragile because you made me fragile," I said, my voice rising despite my attempts to stay calm. "Every time I showed confidence or ambition, you found ways to tear it down. You convinced me I wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't good enough for anything better than what you decided I deserved." Adrian's face hardened, the mask of paternal concern slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "We gave you a roof over your head and food on the table. We supported you through community college when you couldn't even handle a full course load. This is how you show gratitude?" The manipulation was so textbook, so predictable, that I almost laughed at how little creativity they put into their emotional abuse. Nova appeared in the doorway during our argument, still in her pajamas with her phone in her hand. "Aunt Helena wants to talk to all of us," she said quietly, her eyes darting between our parents and me. "She's been calling since yesterday, and she says if we don't have a family meeting today, she's going to her lawyer tomorrow." The mention of legal action made both Adrian and Lorelai go pale, their defensive posturing crumbling as they realized the potential consequences of their theft. "She can't prove anything," Adrian muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "She can prove she sent money specifically for Mira's education," Nova said, holding up her phone. "She has 4 years of bank records with memo lines that say Mira Scholarship Fund on every transfer." Helena arrived an hour later with a briefcase and a grim expression that I'd never seen on her face before. She'd always been the fun aunt, the one who brought expensive gifts. and told stories about her business travels. But today she looked like the successful executive she was, all sharp edges and controlled fury. "I want to see exactly where my money went," she said without preamble, setting her briefcase on the dining room table. "Every dollar, every transfer, every expenditure. I have my bank records and I want to see yours." The next 2 hours were excruciating as Helena methodically went through my parents' financial records, tracking her scholarship payments as they were immediately diverted to pay for Nova's private school tuition, Adrian's business debts, and what appeared to be a vacation to Europe that I'd never been invited on. $180,000, Helena said finally, her voice deadly quiet. "You stole $180,000 from your own daughter's future." She turned to look at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mira, I need you to know that every penny of this money was intended for you. When Adrian told me you were struggling academically, I wanted to make sure you had every opportunity to succeed. I never imagined they would use my generosity to fund their lifestyle while convincing you that you weren't capable of achievement." The validation felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. Someone finally acknowledging that the narrative my parents had created about my limitations was false. Lorelai made one last desperate attempt at manipulation, reaching across the table to grab my hand. "We did this out of love, Mira. We didn't want you to get hurt by trying for something beyond your abilities." But Helena cut her off with a look that could have frozen fire. "Love doesn't involve stealing from your child and lying to your family for 4 years," she said. "Love doesn't involve convincing a bright young woman that she's stupid while using money intended for her education to pay for her sister's private school." Nova had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, but she finally spoke up, her voice shaking. "Mom, Dad, this is wrong. You took Mira's money and gave me opportunities that should have been hers. How is that love?" The most devastating revelation came when Helena pulled out her laptop and showed us email correspondence between her and Adrian spanning the past 4 years. In the messages, Adrian had painted a picture of me as mentally unstable, academically struggling, and possibly suffering from learning disabilities that required expensive private tutoring. "He told me you were seeing a therapist for severe anxiety and depression," Helena said, scrolling through the emails. "He said you needed specialized educational support that wasn't covered by regular financial aid. I increased my contributions twice because I thought you were in crisis." The elaborate fiction my father had created to justify stealing from me was breathtaking in its cruelty. He'd convinced his own sister that I was mentally ill and academically deficient to cover up his theft of my future. As Helena packed up her documents and prepared to leave, she delivered an ultimatum that would change everything. "You have 1 week to come up with a plan to repay what you've stolen," she told my parents. "Either you figure out how to make this right, or I'm filing charges for fraud and embezzlement. Mira deserves the education that money was supposed to provide, and I'm going to make sure she gets it." The threat of legal action seemed to finally break through my parents' denial, Adrian's face crumpling as he realized the potential consequences of his actions. "We don't have that kind of money," he whispered. "The business is failing, the house is mortgaged to the limit. We can't pay it back." Helena's smile was cold and satisfied. "Then you'll have to get creative, won't you? Just like you got creative when you decided to steal from your daughter." The legal proceedings began 3 weeks later when Helena made good on her threat to involve lawyers. She'd hired Clara Hastings, a family law attorney who specialized in financial fraud cases, and within days of their first meeting, we learned that my parents' theft was more extensive than anyone had imagined. Clara discovered that Adrian and Lorelai had been taking money from Helena under false pretenses for nearly 8 years, not just the 4 I'd known about. The early payments had been described as emergency funds for my special educational needs when I was in middle school, money that had actually been used to maintain their lifestyle when Adrian's business first started struggling. "This wasn't opportunistic theft," Clara explained during our first meeting. "This was a sustained, deliberate fraud that involved creating false documentation and maintaining elaborate lies across multiple family relationships." The discovery process revealed financial records that painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond just stealing my scholarship money. Adrian had been intercepting mail addressed to me since I was 16, including college acceptance letters and financial aid offers that I'd never seen. Clara found evidence of at least 3 universities that had accepted me with substantial merit scholarships, including a near-full ride to UC Berkeley that would have covered tuition, housing, and books. My parents had never told me about any of these opportunities, instead convincing me that my only realistic option was community college paid for with student loans. "They didn't just steal money from you," Clara said, her voice tight with professional anger. "They stole your entire academic future." The emotional toll of the legal battle was complicated by the way my extended family began choosing sides. The Montgomerys, my mother's relatives, rallied around Lorelei with claims that Helena was being vindictive and that family problems should be handled privately. My grandmother Montgomery called me repeatedly, insisting that I was destroying the family over money and that forgiveness was more important than justice. Your parents made mistakes, but they love you, she kept saying, as if love could somehow justify 4 years of systematic theft and psychological manipulation. The Youngs, Adrian's cousins, were more divided, with some supporting Helena's legal action, while others whispered that she was being dramatic about a simple misunderstanding. Nova found herself caught in the middle of the family fracture, her guilt over unknowingly benefiting from the stolen money warring with her loyalty to our parents. She'd withdrawn from Whitmore Academy for the spring semester, unable to continue attending a school that was being paid for with money stolen from me. "I can't sit in those classrooms knowing that every class I'm taking is something you should have had," she told me during one of our painful conversations. Her decision to leave school created another crisis in our family, with our parents blaming me for destroying Nova's future and demanding that I drop the legal case to allow her to return to her studies. The manipulation was so obvious that it made me angry rather than guilty. They were trying to use Nova's sacrifice as leverage to avoid consequences for their actions. The most shocking discovery came when Claire's investigation expanded beyond my immediate family. Helena wasn't the only relative who had been sending money for my education. My great-aunt Patricia, who lived in Florida and rarely visited, had been mailing checks directly to my parents for the past 3 years, after Adrian told her I was struggling with medical bills from a learning disability diagnosis. Uncle James, Helena's ex-husband who had maintained close relationships with our family, had contributed to what he thought was my college fund through a series of wire transfers that my parents had described as emergency educational loans. "The total amount stolen from your extended family for your supposed education exceeds $300,000, Claire informed me during a meeting that left me physically sick. Helena's anger reached a new level when she learned about the other family members who had been deceived. They created an entire fictional narrative about Mira's academic and medical struggles, she said, during a family conference call that included the relatives who had been sending money. They convinced all of us that she needed special help, while simultaneously convincing her that she wasn't capable of academic success. It's psychological abuse combined with financial fraud." Great-aunt Patricia's voice was shaking when she spoke. "I've been sending $500 a month for 3 years because Adrian told me Mira needed special tutoring for her learning disabilities. How could they lie about something like that?" The revelation that multiple family members had been contributing to my education fund while I struggled to pay for community college with part-time work and student loans created a new dimension of betrayal. I'd been working evening shifts at the bookstore, eating generic cereal for dinner, and wearing the same 3 outfits to school while my parents were receiving thousands of dollars monthly from relatives who thought they were helping me succeed. The elaborate fiction they'd created about my supposed learning disabilities and mental health struggles had convinced my extended family that I was in crisis, generating sympathy donations that funded Nova's private education and Adrian's failing business ventures. Clara's investigation also uncovered evidence that my parents had been planning to continue the deception indefinitely. She found draft emails on Adrian's computer, asking Helena for additional funding for my graduate school applications and specialized career counseling, requests that would have extended the fraud for several more years. They weren't planning to stop, Clara explained. They had constructed a sustainable system of financial exploitation that could have continued as long as your family members remained willing to help. The premeditation involved in their theft was staggering. They hadn't stumbled into fraud through desperation, but had deliberately crafted a long-term scheme to steal from their own relatives. The legal case expanded beyond simple theft when Clara discovered that my parents had used my social security number to take out several student loans in my name without my knowledge. The loans, totaling nearly $40,000, had been used to pay for Nova's dormitory expenses and Adrian's business operating costs while I remained unaware that debt was accumulating in my name. "This crosses the line into identity theft," Clara informed us. "They've potentially damaged your credit and created financial obligations that you'll be legally responsible for despite never receiving any benefit from the borrowed money." The federal crimes involved in using my identity for fraudulent loan applications meant that the case would likely involve criminal charges rather than just civil litigation. As the scope of my parents' deception became clear, I found myself grieving not just for the money and opportunities they'd stolen, but for the family I thought I belonged to. The people who had raised me weren't just flawed or misguided. They were criminals who had systematically exploited their own relatives' love and generosity, while psychologically abusing me into believing I was incapable of success. The realization that everything I'd been taught about my own limitations was based on lies designed to cover up their theft left me feeling unmoored from my own identity. Who was I, if not the struggling, limited person they'd convinced me I was? The legal settlement took 8 months to finalize, during which my parents were forced to liquidate nearly everything they owned to begin repaying the stolen funds. Clara had built an airtight case that included federal charges for identity theft and mail fraud, which meant Adrian and Lorelei faced potential prison time if they didn't cooperate fully with the restitution process. Their house went up for sale first, the large colonial in Sacramento's expensive Midtown district that had been mortgaged beyond its value to fund their lifestyle. The proceeds barely covered a quarter of what they owed to the various family members they'd defrauded. Adrian's consulting business was dissolved, its remaining assets seized to pay debts, leaving him unemployed at 58 with a criminal record that would make finding new work nearly impossible. Watching my parents' comfortable world collapse should have felt like justice, but instead, it left me with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and grief. Lorelei had aged years in just months, her carefully maintained appearance deteriorating as the stress of public humiliation and financial ruin took its toll. Adrian had developed a tremor in his hands that became more pronounced whenever the legal proceedings were mentioned, and he'd started drinking heavily enough that Nova had expressed concern about his health. "They're destroying themselves," she told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings, her own guilt about the situation weighing heavily on her shoulders. The family gatherings that had once been sources of tension and manipulation had ended entirely, replaced by awkward encounters in courthouse hallways and lawyers' offices. The most challenging part of the settlement process was deciding what to do with the recovered funds. Helena insisted that every penny should go toward my education, but the amount available after legal fees and my parents' debts was significantly less than what had been stolen. Clara had managed to recover about $120,000 through the asset liquidation, plus an additional $30,000 from a retirement account that Adrian had been forced to cash out early. "It's not the full amount," Helena said during one of our planning meetings, "but it's enough to give you the opportunities that money was supposed to provide." The validation of finally having resources designated specifically for my education felt surreal after years of believing I couldn't afford anything better than community college. Nova's decision to transfer to a state school and pay her own way through student loans created another layer of complexity in our family dynamics. She'd refused to continue benefiting from the stolen money, even though legally she had no obligation to give up her education. "I can't sit in classes that were paid for by robbing my sister," she said when our parents begged her to reconsider leaving Whitmore Academy. Her choice to start over at UC Davis, working part-time and taking out loans like I'd been doing, was both an act of solidarity and a form of penance that I hadn't asked for. The guilt she carried about unknowingly benefiting from their fraud was almost as heavy as my anger about being its victim. The process of actually applying to universities at 23 felt like stepping into an alternate version of my life, one where my academic potential had never been systematically undermined. Clara had helped me obtain copies of all the acceptance letters my parents had hidden, and several of the schools were willing to honor their original offers with updated financial aid packages. UC Berkeley's admissions office was particularly accommodating when Ms. Perry, the dean of undergraduate admissions, learned about the circumstances that had prevented me from attending years earlier. "Cases like yours are exactly why we have provisions for non-traditional students," she explained during our phone call. "Your original academic credentials were impressive, and your life experience since then only strengthens your application." Rowan, my cousin who had graduated from Harvard with funding that should have been mine, reached out during this period with an offer that surprised me. He'd been working at a prestigious Boston law firm for 2 years and had saved enough money to contribute toward my education costs. "I always wondered why my college fund was so well funded when yours seemed limited," he admitted during our first real conversation in years. "I want to help make this right." His offer to cover my living expenses during graduate school wasn't motivated by guilt over something he'd had no control over, but by a genuine desire to help repair the damage our family had done. The gesture meant more to me than the financial assistance itself. The psychological work of rebuilding my self-image proved more challenging than navigating the legal and financial aspects of the settlement. Years of being told I wasn't smart enough, capable enough, or ambitious enough had created deeply ingrained patterns of self-doubt that didn't disappear just because I now had evidence to the contrary. I started seeing Dr. Martinez, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and gaslighting, to help process the complex emotions surrounding my parents' betrayal. "They didn't just steal money from you," she explained during one of our sessions. "They stole your belief in your own capabilities. Recovery involves reclaiming both your financial resources and your sense of self-worth." My first semester at UC Berkeley, starting at 24 as a junior transfer student, was both exhilarating and terrifying. I'd been out of academic environments for so long that I worried I'd forgotten how to study effectively, but my professors quickly recognized the maturity and work ethic I'd developed during my years of forced independence. My grades that first semester were better than anything I'd achieved in community college. A 3.8 GPA that proved I was capable of the academic excellence my parents had convinced me was beyond my reach. "You're not just succeeding," my advisor Professor Chen told me after reviewing my midterm evaluations. "You're excelling in ways that suggest you've always had this potential." The transformation wasn't just academic but personal, as I began to understand how thoroughly my parents' manipulation had shaped my self-perception. I'd spent years believing I was fragile, sensitive, and incapable of handling challenges, when in reality I'd been systematically undermined every time I showed strength or ambition. The young woman who had worked multiple jobs while attending community college, who had maintained her dignity during years of subtle emotional abuse, who had pursued legal action against her own parents to reclaim her stolen future, was anything but fragile. I was discovering reserves of resilience and determination that had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of imposed self-doubt. Nova and I had developed a new relationship based on mutual respect, rather than the family hierarchy that had previously defined our interactions. She visited me at Berkeley regularly, marveling at the campus and the opportunities I was finally able to pursue. "I'm proud of you for fighting back," she told me during one visit. "I don't think I would have been brave enough to take on the whole family like you did." Her support meant everything to me, especially knowing that her choice to align with justice rather than family loyalty had cost her relationships with our parents and some of our extended relatives. We were both rebuilding our lives from the wreckage of our parents' deception, but we were doing it together. The final piece of the legal settlement came when Adrian and Lorelei were required to write formal letters of apology to each family member they had defrauded, letters that would become part of the court record. Adrian's letter to me was brief and stilted, acknowledging his poor financial decisions, but stopping short of taking full responsibility for the systematic theft and psychological abuse. Lorelei's letter was longer but filled with self-pity and attempts to justify their actions as misguided parental protection. Neither letter felt like genuine remorse, but rather like legal obligations being fulfilled with minimal effort. Clara assured me that the formal apologies were primarily for the court record, and that I shouldn't expect emotional satisfaction from what were essentially legal documents. 3 years after the legal settlement was finalized, I stood in my cap and gown at UC Berkeley's graduation ceremony, holding a summa cum laude degree in economics with a minor in psychology. Helena sat in the front row of the family section, tears streaming down her face as she applauded my name being called. Nova was beside her, having completed her own degree at UC Davis the previous year, and Rowan had flown out from Boston to witness what he called the completion of justice. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family members celebrating my achievement were the ones who had been defrauded by my parents, while Adrian and Lorelei were nowhere to be seen. They'd moved to a small apartment in Fresno after losing their house, and our relationship had remained severed despite occasional attempts at reconciliation that felt more about their guilt than genuine remorse. The job offers started coming in during my final semester, with 3 major consulting firms and 2 tech companies extending opportunities that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. I accepted a position with McKinsey & Company in San Francisco, starting at a salary that exceeded what both my parents had earned combined during their best years. The first day I walked into their downtown office, wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly rent during community college, I thought about the young woman who had believed she wasn't smart enough for anything beyond part-time retail work. Dr. Martinez had helped me understand that success wouldn't erase the trauma of my parents' betrayal, but it could serve as evidence that their assessment of my capabilities had been deliberately false. Helena and I had developed a relationship that transcended our legal partnership, becoming the kind of mentor-mentee bond that I'd never experienced with my own parents. She'd started attending my therapy sessions occasionally, working through her own guilt about not recognizing the signs of my parents' deception sooner. "I should have known something was wrong when you seemed so resigned to limited options," she told Dr. Martinez during one joint session. "The Mira I knew as a child was curious and ambitious. I should have questioned why that had changed." Her self-blame was misplaced, but understandable, and working through it together had strengthened our relationship in ways that felt healing for both of us. My parents made their final attempt at reconciliation 6 months after my graduation, showing up unannounced at my apartment in San Francisco, with a letter they'd apparently been working on for months. Adrian looked older than his 61 years, his hair completely gray, and his clothes hanging loose on a frame that suggested he'd lost significant weight. Lorelei had abandoned her previous polished appearance entirely, looking tired and defeated in a way that might have triggered sympathy if I hadn't known the calculation behind their timing. "We know we made terrible mistakes," Adrian said when I reluctantly agreed to let them into my living room. "We want to make amends before it's too late." The phrase, "too late," hung in the air with implications I didn't want to explore. The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which they still didn't understand the gravity of what they'd done. They spoke about their financial mistakes and poor communication, as if they'd simply mismanaged a family budget, rather than systematically stealing from multiple relatives while psychologically abusing me for years. "We always believed you were capable of success," Lorelai insisted, apparently having rewritten history to cast themselves as supportive parents who had simply made some bad decisions. "We just wanted to protect you from disappointment." The gaslighting was so automatic, so ingrained, that I realized they might actually believe their revised version of events. They'd constructed a narrative where they were flawed but well-meaning parents rather than criminals who had deliberately sabotaged their daughter's future. When I refused their attempts at reconciliation, explaining that their apologies lacked genuine accountability, Adrian's facade finally cracked. "You've got everything you wanted now," he said, his voice taking on the familiar edge of resentment. "The fancy job, the expensive apartment, the whole family treating you like some kind of victim. What more do you need from us?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about his mindset. He saw my success as evidence that no real harm had been done, rather than understanding that I'd achieved it despite their sabotage, not because of it. "I need you to acknowledge that you stole my future and tried to convince me I was too stupid to deserve better," I replied. "I need you to understand that your actions were criminal, not parental." They left without providing either acknowledgement. Nova had warned me about their visit, having maintained minimal contact with our parents out of obligation rather than affection. "They're telling people that you're being vindictive and that the family persecution has gone too far," she'd told me during our weekly phone call. "They're positioning themselves as the real victims in this situation." The information didn't surprise me, but confirmed that they remained fundamentally unchanged despite losing everything. Their capacity for self-reflection was apparently as limited as their capacity for genuine remorse. The parents who had raised me were simply not capable of the kind of accountability that would be necessary for any real relationship. The discovery that came 18 months later, delivered through Clara's continued investigation into my parents' financial history, provided the final piece of their story. Adrian and Lorelai had been running similar schemes with other families in their social circle, convincing friends and acquaintances to contribute to various emergency funds for fictional crises involving their children. The Hendersons had given them $8,000 for Nova's supposed medical expenses. The Patel family had contributed to my alleged therapy costs. The pattern of deception extended far beyond our family, encompassing years of systematic fraud that had funded their lifestyle while destroying multiple relationships. "This wasn't just about stealing your education money," Clara explained. "This was their primary source of income for nearly a decade." The federal charges that followed this discovery resulted in both my parents receiving prison sentences. Adrian for 18 months, and Lorelai for 12, along with restitution orders that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The news reached me through Clara rather than any family member, as Nova and I had agreed that we didn't want direct updates about their legal troubles. "They'll likely never be able to fully repay what they stole from all their victims," Clara informed me, "but the criminal convictions will prevent them from continuing these patterns of fraud." The justice felt abstract rather than satisfying, more like the closing of a legal case than the resolution of a family trauma. Helena and I established the Cross-Lang Educational Foundation 3 months after my parents were sentenced, using the remaining recovered funds plus contributions from other family members to provide scholarships for students whose educational opportunities had been undermined by family dysfunction. "We can't undo what happened to you," Helena said during the foundation's launch event, "but we can prevent other young people from having their potential stolen by the people who should be supporting them." The foundation's first recipient was a 19-year-old whose parents had used his college fund to pay for addiction treatment that never happened, leaving him working fast food to save money for community college. My wedding to James, a fellow consultant I'd met during my second year at McKinsey, took place in Helena's backyard with Nova as my maid of honor, and Rowan walking me down the aisle in place of the father who was serving his prison sentence. The guest list included chosen family members, close friends, and colleagues who had become part of my support system, but no one from my parents' generation except Helena and the relatives who had supported me through the legal battle. "This is what family looks like," Nova said during her speech at the reception, gesturing toward the gathering of people who had chosen to be part of my life, people who celebrate your success instead of undermining it. The final contact from my parents came in the form of a letter forwarded through Clara's office, written from Adrian's federal prison, and requesting permission to attend any future grandchildren's births or major life events. The letter contained no acknowledgement of wrongdoing and no genuine apology, just a request for access to milestones in a life they had tried to destroy. I read it once, then filed it away without responding. Some relationships cannot be repaired, And some people cannot be trusted with access to your happiness. The family I'd built through choice, perseverance, and mutual respect was complete without the people who had taught me that love could be a weapon used to justify cruelty. The young woman they had abandoned emotionally and financially had become someone they no longer had the power to diminish.